Hi everyone, welcome to a special Data Dialogues episode. I'm joined today by a familiar face, but in a different role. So, hey Richard, how's it going?
Very well, thank you, mate. And you?
Yeah, well. So let's reintroduce you, I guess, to this audience. You have a bit of a story to tell.
I do indeed. Well, I think most people who are watching this podcast will probably know that I'm a former employee of Certus Solutions Ignition, having worked with Jules for it was going on 4 years, I think, in the end. But earlier this year, I decided I wanted to branch off and do my own thing. As you know, I've been working around personal information in various forms for probably 25 odd years. It's always been part of the things that I've talked about. I've advocated for data privacy. I've advised clients on data management solutions using personal and sensitive information. So I've kind of accumulated a tremendous amount of knowledge in the area of data privacy, data compliance, and obviously data management strategies. And with the government response to the Privacy Act review earlier this year, it was clear that privacy is going to be top of mind for a lot of organisations. And we know from the work we did at Certus that there's quite a few organisations that, while they have a pretty strong technology department, they may be lacking somewhat in the data management skills, or indeed, in particular, data privacy and data compliance. So I thought, well, now's the time to start my own thing, and I've created a business, Data Design Consulting, basically offering organizations services to review their privacy policies, their practices, and make sure that there's no, significant risks of a breach against the privacy and other regulations, the Privacy Act and others. As well as providing advice on how to improve their management of personal information. And that, of course, includes training. Some people may be aware that I've been training courses for the Fundraising Institute Australia for the last 4 years in data privacy and data management. So everything sort of came around where I thought now's the time to start my own thing. And so, I'm tremendously pleased to be bringing these services back and talking with the Certus audience about data privacy.
Great, and obviously, as probably most of our audience know, not only is the Data Vault Innovators community an ecosystem of various vendors and service providers, but that Certus and Ignition engage specifically in that way. And so while we lose Richard out of the immediate fold, he's still part of the ecosystem, and that's, I guess, part of the reason that we're on this chat today. And I think specifically for the DVIC audience, the connection between data privacy and how you can use Data Vault to make that you meet some of those requirements is very clear. But obviously, sometimes it's more about how you articulate that to the executives as well, to understand their obligations and not just the responsibilities, but also the accountability that exists there. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what's changed? You're talking about, obviously, the government response to changes. So maybe give us a little bit of an overview of what's happening in the world of data privacy.
Sure thing. So the Privacy Act itself is, quite old. It is still referred to as the Privacy Act 1988. And it's gone through some updates since then, but it hasn't had a significant update in a while. And so a couple of years ago, the government went out to industry and they said, look, we need to update our privacy regulations to be in line with our major trading partners. So please tell us what you think should be happening. And part of that as well, they went out and did a survey of individuals looking for their sentiment when it came to their personal information, how they felt about it, where their concerns were. And so that process resulted in about 116 proposals being made to the government for changes. And the government has then issued a response to that indicating, which ones they're going to accept. And pretty much they've agreed to all 116. some of which are going to be enacted very quickly in 2024. And there's a whole bunch that are going to require a little more consultation, but certainly will result in changes. And the reason why the government did this, as I say, one of the big drivers was it hasn't been updated in a while, our Privacy Act. We have a lot of organizations already having to comply with things like GDPR, which goes beyond, in many ways, what the Privacy Act does. And it's clear that in the digital age in which we live, if we're going to remain a competitive force on the world market, we need to be demonstrating to our trading partners that we take the management of personal information as seriously as they do. So from the government standpoint, it's very much an international priority to step up. On the individual side, the feedback they've gotten, I think, has gotten a lot of people sitting up and taking notice. 83% of people in the survey were very clear that they have concerns about how their personal information is being used, and overwhelmingly people want more control over their information. So there is a big push now towards updating the Privacy Act. There were 5 different themes, as the government put it. The main one, or the first one, being bringing it up to date with the digital age. So there's going to be a lot of redefinitions and clarifying what personal information is. I think a lot of us are very used to knowing, name, address, phone, and email. But personal information is going to get a lot more extensions. The Privacy Act due for an update for a while. It's going to happen very soon. And then, of course, we have other things going on as well. We have the notifiable data breach scheme, which is now starting to put a lot of brands front and center. If you have a breach, we are obliged to report it. That information then makes it into the public domain, which, of course, was going to have repercussions in terms of trust in brand and so forth. But there's also a lot of work going on in the government now, signaling they're going to extend the digital ID service. So it's going beyond government services, and we'll now start seeing private enterprise being able to use digital identification for online transactions and so forth. So there's a great deal of stuff going on. And now is kind of the time to start thinking about, where and how improvements and changes might need to be made, to meet these requirements in the future.
Yeah, you mentioned GDPR. There's a bit of an overlapping web of privacy legislation now, isn't there? But obviously, if you hold data from a European citizen in your systems, then you're essentially exposed to GDPR as well. So it makes sense that we're getting lined up, but I think it's one of those things that you can't plead ignorance of. You need to be well informed around what's required by our government, what's required by the governments of all of the regions that you trade in.
So it's funny. I think you mentioned before the responsibilities and the risks that business can wear. Some of the changes that are coming are actually going to be very significant. One being that we're going to see a dramatic increase in the kind of controls individuals will have over their data. They will have the right. Well, they have the right now to understand what information you hold, and they can opt out of certain marketing communications, for example. But under the proposed changes, that could then translate into, I want to prevent you from using my information, for example, in your analytics and so forth, which has then started to really drive a conversation. And I'm involved right now in a number of different conversations online with different points of view of, how do we deal with the request for de-identification? Or the right to be forgotten, which is going to be, again, one of those big changes. And to your point about the Data Vault audiences, Data Vault absolutely lends itself to be able to meet those kinds of obligations in a pretty meaningful way. So I'm sure we'll see a lot of debate in the Data Vault community about the right architectural approach, the right methodologies and so forth. In fact, Knowles and I had an exchange a couple of months ago where we were discussing the fact that even your business identifier, say in your CRM system, if that becomes personal information, what is that going to mean in the world of right to be forgotten? The other big one that organizations need to be really focusing on, well, two really, is first of all, the OAIC is going to be given a lot more budget to enforce the regulations. So there'll be a lot more oversight. And coupled with that, individuals are likely going to be given the right to take direct action. So if you're misusing personal information, if you're not able to comply with their requests, you can expect to be taken to court, because people will obviously take their opportunity to use that mechanism where and how possible. And then coupled with that, the requirement to nominate a data privacy officer, someone that's a senior employee in the organization whose role is responsible for data privacy, should start making a lot of organizations take another look and realize that, things are about to get a lot more focused in the area of privacy. Individuals, the public, have a great deal of concern over how information is used. They want a lot more control, and we as data professionals are going to have to meet that requirement, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I think it points to the fact that people need a plan. We all know that, personally identifiable data exists not just in production systems. It can be all through the IT landscape and beyond, even into hard copies and those sorts of things. And so that right to be forgotten is, or even just obviously the risk of having copies that might be sitting in test and dev and those sorts of things, as well as you certainly have to have a plan, or else you're going to be in trouble. So I was going to ask you about sort of why should people be thinking about this now, but I think you've probably answered that. It's pretty clear that there's been changes. There's a lot of stuff people should really know, so they can create a really clear and consistent plan for the organisation.
I will say the reason why now is the time, because there might be a temptation to wait and see, take that adoption. Let's wait and see what the changes are. The reality is that even now we know there's a lot of organizations that are probably not compliant with the current regulations as they stand. They may not be significant risks, but there are certainly going to be a number of areas where improvements could be made. And as we know, the change required isn't just going to be a technology decision. While technology might play a role, while your data architecture may play a role, a large part of it is a cultural shift as well. That more people in the organization need to understand the regulations. They need to understand the privacy handling procedures in place and so forth. And that shift of changing behaviors really does take time. It's not something you can just implement overnight and expect everyone is going to adopt. Human beings are human beings. We will always take the shortcuts to make our lives a little easier. And so now is the time to start identifying where do we have those gaps, where do we need to improve, and to have a plan in place over the next 12 to 24 months to make the changes incrementally, so that when these regulations are in effect, we have already invested the time and effort. Otherwise, it's going to be a massive project which is going to inflate cost and potentially result in not the right outcomes anyway.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot to know. Things have changed very recently, and it's urgent to do now, I guess, because the implications are great. Not just the brand damage, but obviously there's, at least with some of these programs, there's fines and other things that you could be exposed to as well, right up to the executive level. So what you've done, I guess the purpose of us having this chat is that we've engaged you to deliver training courses. You've created a training course specifically around the Australian privacy principles. So why don't you tell us a bit about what you've actually created and what the course will be?
Sure thing. So the course is designed to be a one-day course, but delivered over 2 half days, because no matter how entertaining I think I can be, a day of data privacy is going to be a hard session for anybody. So we split it into 2 half days, and the first half a day really is an opportunity to get right into understanding the current Privacy Act. So right now we operate under what we call the Australian Privacy Principles. There's 13 of them, and they cover things like how information should be collected, what information we need to tell people, how it can be used. There's specifics around direct marketing and the right to change information, accuracy, and so forth. And while some people may have somewhat of an understanding, it's worthwhile going right into some of those principles. And where we've taken a lot of the content is not only do we go directly to the Act to look at what does the principle itself say, but the government also issues guidelines that give explanatory notes, some best practice, and other elements that support each of those privacy principles. So a lot of that first half day is we go into enough detail that people should be able to come away having a really good understanding of what each principle says and the kind of things we should be doing in order to comply with those principles. Obviously, we know now what changes are very likely coming in the next year or so. So we'll spend some time talking about what they mean and what the implications are. And we'll also talk about things like the California Data Protection Act and GDPR, because again, there's still some questions outstanding about what that looks like. So that's really what the first half is about, is to really getting a line in the sand to say, what are our obligations right now? What do we mean when we say personal or sensitive information? What overseas regulations do we need to be thinking about? And so at the end of that first session, as I say, that's where we start with. What do I need to know right now? And what I've found in other courses that I've run is at the end of that time, you can already see people starting to take notes and thinking about, I don't think I've got that covered well enough, or I'm worried about this area or this system over here, and they'll go away and ask questions. And that's great. And then the second session then is to say, well, what things should we be doing as business managers, as data managers, in order to give ourselves the best chance of complying with those regulations? So we start getting into things like organizational structures around building a data council and tools like an effective data classification system or data cataloging. But then there are some quite specific things as well, like privacy impact assessments. While I think a lot of organizations are using them, I think it's still pretty much hit and miss. And that will absolutely become part of the requirement under the Privacy Act and is already mentioned in the GDPR anyway. So we really do get into, on the second day, what are the tools, practices, procedures that we can be putting in place that will allow us to improve how we're managing personal and indeed sensitive information within the organization. So that when you combine the two, basically, anyone coming out of this course should realistically be able to start the conversation back in their organization to say, well, how robust is our privacy policy? Does our policy match up with what we actually do? Do our staff know where to access the privacy policy? And have we classified our information appropriately? Do we have a robust catalog so that we know what we've got, where it is, what it can be used for, what permissions, etc., etc.? Because once you have that information in place, then you are much better able to really build the processes to improve and take better care of really what is the most valuable asset a lot of organizations have.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well then, clearly it's important. So who in an organization should actually attend one of these training courses?
Well, it's a non-technical course, so we're not going to go into all the technology approaches that could be applied. Would be there forever. And as I've just mentioned, that you often do get different points of view. So we're more taking a a systemic approach to say, as I say, the practices and processes. So the people that really should attend, I think, are going to fall into a number of areas. Senior managers, for one. So if you're, sitting on the exec of an organization that is collecting and using personal information in the operations, then getting a handle on really where those obligations lie and an understanding of really the practices that should be in place will enable you to ask the right questions and to make sure the teams responsible for those processes are in fact, implementing them, they're being followed, and you can then feel a little bit more comfortable about how things are going. Because at the end of the day, it's the executive team, it's the board that are going to ultimately have to answer for any breaches. But then, of course, you have your data teams as well. If you're about to build a new data warehouse and you're thinking about your architecture, understanding where the regulations are going to make certain requirements of you now and in the future will inform how you architect. One of the other members of the Certis family, James Hartwright, and I have got a very robust and ongoing email chain right now about de-identification. And one of the feelings in the data vault community is, well, you can put personal information into a different satellite and hive it off and carve it out there. Other people are of the point of view, you shouldn't be putting PII inside of your data warehouse at all. So again, if you're in that process of thinking about how do I need to change my model, what am I doing, regardless of whether it's for privacy purposes or not, understanding the regulations and what you need to do will absolutely inform that. So I think they're probably the two main audiences for sure.
Yeah, it feels like you could certainly anything from a data engineer, warehouse manager, executive managers, even board members, probably also marketing as well. I think there's definitely an angle here where marketing need to be aware, I guess, of how they're using PII.
There's certainly a lot of information that marketing are responsible for collecting, as they're out in the world and utilizing. Again, from an architectural standpoint, arguments to be made to say, does a marketer ever need to see personal information? In most organizations, I would guess that most marketers can see PII in various shapes or forms, but should they? Again, these are the kind of questions that should be asked. So you're absolutely right. And of course, in terms of that executive level, I'm sure that like the chief financial officer often is responsible for risk in terms of financial risk, and this would fall into that category as well.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when it gets onto that accountability side of it.
Yeah, for sure.
So, aside from the training, is there anything else people should be thinking about, maybe practically?
Look,
to start
for sure. Look, I mean, to be a little self-serving, I think doing a review of your privacy compliance is not a bad way to start. Having somebody come in or even doing it yourselves, but really taking a close look at how data is being collected, where it's being stored, how it's being used, and how that relates to the various regulations. And then really taking a close look at your privacy policy. When was the last time it was updated and really brought up to date with how you actually do use information? And that's a critical element as well, is understanding that just because you say you do things in a certain way doesn't necessarily mean it's being done that way all the time. So there may be opportunities, again, architecturally or using technology to limit access or change the permissions for how people can access information, etc. So I think from my perspective, it's really making sure that you understand right now, answering really two questions against all of the regulations you have to comply with. One, do I comply in some way, shape, or form? And that's a binary yes or no question. If you don't have a collection statement, then you are in breach already. But you might have a collection statement that is written in gobbledygook. So you could say, I do have a collection statement, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best version it could be. And again, you go to the guidelines, and they make it very clear that it should be plain language, and they give guides of how it should be formatted and so forth. So there's always an opportunity to improve. And having that list of, well, these are all the things I could do to improve and make sure I'm protecting information better, and then scoring that against, the effort in order to implement and the level of risk if I don't, then gives a simple prioritization to work through to improve. And look, the reality is data privacy management is a never-ending cycle. You're never going to get to a point where you can wash your hands and say, I'm done. There's always going to be variations to the Act. There's always going to be new technologies or new ways of using information that will require ongoing reviews and so forth. So, yeah. Aside from the training, again, looking at what you're doing now and knowing where your risks are is a great first step.
Yeah, and it used to only be the realm of our really largest organisations, banks, and other things. But it's this needs to be considered right down to very small organisations now.
Small businesses
it's no longer the realm.
Will no longer be exempt. Under the changes, the proposed changes. Right now, if you're a small business under $25 million in revenue, then you can avoid much of what goes on in the Privacy Act. That will no longer be the case. Small business will absolutely be required to comply as well. And I should stress that the principles are just that. The government isn't stipulating how you should do things. They use a reasonableness test. So if you're a small organization of, $20 million a year in revenue, how you comply will probably look very different to how one of the big four banks complies because of budget, because of technology, because of skills and resources. So there's always that element of that gray area, which again is why really taking a close look and a pragmatic look at how you're achieving your compliance is an important thing to do.
All right. So obviously, if you're watching this and you are interested in this, then we have Richard lined up to deliver this course coming up very shortly. So all the details are there. And obviously, if you'd like to have Richard come out and help you with looking at what you're doing around privacy, then you can reach out through Ignition and we can help out with that. If this topic is of interest, there is a couple of other Data Dialogue episodes that I'd recommend as well. We've done one on marketing without cookies, or in a cookieless world, I think we called that.
Yep.
There's another one on the right to be forgotten. So this is an ongoing topic, and I think it's definitely something that people need to get on top of. So the upcoming course should be a really great way to get some of your people across this and think about who in the organisation really needs to be informed. So I'd encourage you to get on. So Rich, thanks for joining today. Really appreciate
Thank you, man.
That, and I really appreciate the engaging in this different way and bringing something really unique to the audience.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing everyone on the course.